On March 9th, Mark Carney, with an overwhelming majority, succeeded Justin Trudeau as the new leader of the Liberal Party of Canada. This positions him to becoming the new Prime Minister of Canada. Naturally though, this raises a lot of questions such as, how can he be Prime Minister if he doesn't have a seat in the House of Commons? How can he be Prime Minister if Canadians didn't specifically vote for him? Who is Mark Carney, the person? Who is Mark Carney, the politician? What are some potential red flags, as all politicians come with them? Every section will be timestamped below, so you can jump to the part that interests you the most. So, let's get started. How can he be Prime Minister if he doesn't have a seat in the House of Commons? I've seen this argument pop up a lot online, and for good reason. Civics class is only taught for half a semester in 4 years of high school, so let's be honest, most of us aren't exactly experts on Canadian politics. Jokes aside, a Prime Minister does not need to have a seat in the House of Commons, but for practical reasons, they should have a seat. This distinction between need and should is very important, as it's to do with our democracy. Say for a reason a Prime Minister loses their seat, do they immediately step down? No, and it's happened before. In 1878, the Conservatives won the federal election, but Macdonald lost his riding. If having a seat in the House were mandatory, that would mean that he would have been ineligible to lead as the Prime Minister. Instead, just a month later, a Conservative PM in Marquette, Manitoba resigned, allowing Macdonald to run in a by-election and return to Parliament unopposed. This is not a one-time occurrence either. William Lyon Mackenzie King faced the same issue in 1925 and 1945. Kim Campbell in 1993. Actually, the situation of Kim Campbell and Mark Carney is astoundingly similar. So why does it happen so rarely, and if it's not required, why is it still important? Well, the House of Commons is where laws are made. It's where MPs debate policies and where party leaders challenge one another. Since the Prime Minister is a leader of their own party, you can see how things get complicated if they're not physically present in the House to represent their party and take part in the lawmaking. But there's also a democratic reason why a seat is not mandatory. During a federal election, people can run independently without being MPs. If Canadians feel the best leader of their country is not currently in Parliament, they should have the option to elect them. Otherwise, it would not be a true democracy. This is a gray area, and it might be confusing because it's a gray area. This gray area exists for a reason. It's to protect the will of the people. How can he be Prime Minister if Canadians did not specifically vote for him? This is another common question, often asked alongside the previous one. If Canadians did not vote for Carney, how can he just take office? Why didn't Trudeau's resignation trigger an election? Well, think back to the 2021 federal election. Who did you actually vote for? It wasn't for Trudeau, it wasn't O'Toole, and it wasn't even Blanchet. You voted for the MP in your riding. That's because in Canada, we elect members of Parliament, not the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister is simply the leader of the ruling party. If the leader steps down, their party can choose a replacement without triggering an election, unless the government loses confidence of the House, which is not what happened here. And this is not new either. It happened in 2003 when Jean Chrétien resigned and Paul Martin became the Prime Minister without a general election. More recently, in 2015, Alberta's Premier Jim Prentice resigned and the ruling Progressive Conservatives replaced him with Dave Hancock until an election was called. The system ensures stability, so Canada is not thrown into an election every time a party leader steps down. You can disagree with it, but please, for the sake of whatever God you pray to, those are the rules. Stop running to conspiracies and be careful of politicians who attempt to point you to conspiracies. Who is Mark Carney, the person? Mark Carney, born in 1965 in the Northwest Territories but moved to Edmonton at a young age. Interestingly, politics runs in the family. His father ran as a candidate in the 1980 federal election in the riding of Edmonton South. He did not win, but I thought it was interesting that Carney isn't the only person in his family to step into the political arena. Carney went on to study at Harvard, where he would graduate with high honors in economics. He then pursued further further education at Oxford, earning both a master's and a PhD in economics. Beyond his career, he's also an author. His book, Values: Building a Better World for All, is deep and complex. But to sum it up very briefly, he argues that financial crisis, inequality, and environmental destruction stem from a shift in values. Society, he says, has moved from valuing things for intrinsic worth like fairness, sustainability, and human well-being to valuing everything purely on its market price. He calls this shift moving from market economies to market societies. He also touched on this in his 2015 speech, The Tragedy of Horizons, where he warns about the dangers of being too short-sighted. His core message: we should focus on sustainable economic growth, balancing today's prosperity with the well-being of future generations. He pushes for proactive rather than reactive policies, arguing that by the time we react, the damage is often already done and costs are far greater. Reading his work and listening to his speeches, it's clear he emphasizes long-term stewardship, taking responsibility not just for today, but for the future as well. Who is Mark Carney, the politician? Mark Carney is a well-known name in Canadian politics, despite having very little direct experience as a politician. His reputation comes from his time as the governor of the Bank of Canada. But before we get into that, let's take a quick look at his career leading up to it. In 2003, he joined the Bank of Canada as the deputy governor. A year later, he moved to Finance Canada, serving as the deputy minister, while also acting as the G7 deputy for Canada. With all this experience, he was the natural successor to the then governor of the Bank of Canada, David Dodge. Carney initially joined as an advisor to Dodge in 2007 before formally taking over on February 1st, 2008, making him at the time the youngest central banker among both G8 and G20 nations. His appointment could not have come at a worse time. The 2008 global financial crisis, the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression, was about to hit. What caused it? In short, American banks handed out risky loans to people who could not afford them. A massive wave of defaults followed, causing the housing market to collapse, utterly collapse. This in turn crashed the stock market, wiped out millions of jobs, and left millions of Americans homeless. Some of the biggest financial institutions like the Lehman Brothers completely collapsed under the pressure. Others, like Bank of America, needed massive bailouts to survive. I mean, it was so bad that I remember seeing news reports about houses in Detroit selling for less than $1,000. Whole neighborhoods were abandoned. It was a financial disaster. And obviously, due to the intrinsic relationship between America and Canada, it had negative effects in Canada as well. This is where Mark Carney made his name. His handling of the crisis in Canada didn't just protect the country, it launched him into superstardom. And I'm not kidding about superstardom. He was literally dubbed the rockstar central banker for how well he managed the crisis. That reputation wasn't just local either. His performance was so widely praised that he would later go on to become the governor of Bank of England, the first non-Brit to ever hold that position. But let's talk about what he actually did during the global crisis. One of Carney's major actions as the governor was to aggressively cut interest rates. By making borrowing cheaper, he encouraged business to invest, consumers to keep spending, and ultimately helped prevent a total economic collapse. Lower interest rates meant businesses could access credit more easily, keeping them afloat during a time when global markets were in free fall. Beyond just domestic policy, Carney played a key role in coordinating with global central banks to ensure liquidity did not dry up. This was critical because Canadian banks rely on international credit banks. If those markets froze, Canadian banks could have faced a financial crisis of their own. His proactive measures ensured that banks had access to cash when they needed it and were able to continue lending and functioning. Perhaps one of the most important reasons Canada weathered the crisis better than many nations was Carney's strict stance on risky lending. While American banks had fueled the crisis by handing out high-risk mortgages to people who could not afford them, Canadian banks under Carney's guidance were far more conservative. They avoided the reckless lending that led to the massive defaults in the US, helping Canada avoid a housing market crash of the same scale. He also placed a strong emphasis on market confidence. In a move that was controversial at the time, he pledged to keep interest rates low for as long as necessary, provided market conditions allowed. And his influence didn't just stop at Canadian borders. As the chair of the Financial Stability Board, he helped shape Basel III, the new international banking regulations. All of this to say that it paints a picture of a leader who understands the pulse of the economy. With Canadians frustrated by economic uncertainty, Trump's tariffs, and concerns over inflation, the next prime minister must inspire confidence in their ability to navigate financial challenges. Potential red flags. No leader is without flaws, and Mark Carney is no exception. Lack of political and elected experience. Carney is an exceptionally qualified central banker with deep knowledge of the economy. But being prime minister requires more than just economic expertise. It demands skills like negotiation, coalition building, and understanding public sentiment, skills typically developed through years of political experience. Though he has worked closely with politicians, serving as Bank of Canada governor under Harper and later advising Justin Trudeau, he has never actually held an elected office. That said, it's not necessarily a deal breaker. Carney is clearly a brilliant mind and can learn on the job, but the learning curve will be steep, and voters should keep in mind that politics is a different beast from economic policy. Corporate interests and economic nationalism. So I'm going to do my best not to get into WEF conspiracies here. I actually want to make a whole video on WEF, how it is kind of a negative thing, but people are taking it too far. But back to the point. Some Canadians are wary of Carney's close ties to the global business elites. To be fair, he has spent much of his career in elite financial circles, ranging from Goldman Sachs to central banking, and later as a top executive as Brookfield Asset Management. While this gives him strong economic credentials, it also raises concerns about whether he would prioritize working class Canadians or corporate interests. One major example is Brookfield's decision to relocate its headquarters from Canada to New York, while Carney held a senior leadership role. Critics argue that a future prime minister should be working to keep major companies in Canada, not overseeing their move abroad. That being said, Canada's Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner requires all public office holders, including the Prime Minister, to disclose their assets and divest from any controlled assets to eliminate conflict of interest. Carney has already consulted with the Commissioner and moved his assets into a blind trust. Concerns about a corporate background are understandable, but it's important to separate legitimate scrutiny from conspiracy theories. Even Pierre Poilievre, the other leading candidate, has allegedly a rather large net worth. Realistically, no high-level politician is a squeaky clean superhero, and Canadians should judge Carney by his policies rather than just his financial background. And if they do so, then make sure to do it for all sides, not just for Carney. This should really just be a concern for all politicians. Usually all of them make money, are able to grow their interests and connections with business elites while they serve as politicians. It's really an issue for everyone, but at least Carney has quickly disclosed his assets, divested,